Thank you. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to be speaking about identity and inequality. So as you know, I have a lot of work on networks. I also have a lot of work on social identity. And the focus of the social identity that I'll be speaking about today is inequality. And you've been here, you guys have been amazing with your stamina, coming to all of these speakers and listening to everyone. And so I'm going to try and be a bit provocative this morning. I'm going to, well, actually, you know, it's actually unusual. This week, usually I'm the provocative person. I don't think this week I'll be particularly provocative. We've had a lot of provocative speakers, and that's also been wonderful. But, you know, let's engage this material. So the first thing I want to do is define what I mean by identity. Okay? So identity is a concept which appears in many social sciences. So how have George Akerlof and I translated that into economics? So first of all, identity we can think of as a person's sense of self, a person's self-image, how a person views him or herself, or how others view them. And so identity can be used as a descriptor. You could say, I am Hispanic. Identity can be used a way of describing feelings and emotions. I have a strong sense of identity. I feel good about myself. And this judgment of how well I feel about myself depends on the norms that you hold for yourself. So I feel good about who I am because I'm abiding by what I think I should be doing. Okay? And this can be attached to the social category or the descriptor Hispanic. So how Hispanic or how good about myself I feel if I'm Hispanic, and I think of myself as Hispanic, depends on the extent to which I'm sort of living up to the notion of what Hispanic means. I should say, by the way, that when I run through this talk, I'll be using a lot of American examples. That's my social context. That's the one I know. But in no way should this be viewed as a comment on American society. We are trying to, well, there will be a little comments on American society along the way. But the basic idea is to establish a framework which can be applied to any social context. And the point is to be attentive to that particular social context. Okay. So obviously this issue about being Hispanic is a big deal in the United States, and what language you speak and so on. So I'm proud to be a Hispanic, or I feel good about myself, depends on the extent to which I live up to the ideals or norms as society defines them, and to the extent to which I accept those ideals and norms. Okay, so we want to build a notion of utility where individuals have preferences over their own actions and other people's actions that depend on these identity and norms. Okay? So individuals care about their own actions depending on identity. So my utility is enhanced when I abide by the norms for my category. So if I'm Hispanic and I speak Spanish and I cheer for Mexico, well, if I'm Mexican, I guess, and I cheer for Mexico rather than the US during a Mexico-US soccer game, that's the really hot rivalry over in North America. You know, that you feel good about that. And individuals also care about other actions. There are externalities. When somebody else, who I think of as being like me, but they don't do what's expected of them, that makes me say, what am I doing? It makes me potentially question myself and my own actions. And of course, people could retaliate against those who violate those norms. So why do we want to do all of this? So I mentioned with networks way back in the very first day, why do we want to build a model with networks? We want to build a model with networks because we're getting something new. If we can get what we have, if we can get our story, our trade-offs with a standard model that's relatively parsimonious, maybe we don't need to build a network model. Well, the similar thing could be said about an identity model. Why do we want a model with identity? Well, because we're going to be able to understand different patterns of behavior. With this new model of utility, individuals will be making choices, they'll be interacting strategically, and we can derive patterns of behavior that cannot be explained, okay, so cannot be explained by standard models. And then I have in parentheses, or uncomfortably explained. So I just want to pause on that a second. Any economist worth his or her salt can construct a model that will generate any kind of outcome and result that you want. That's what we're trained to do. right? We can write down a model of utility, we can write down the technology, we can write down the constraints, and if you're worth your salt, you can construct that model. But then I do think we also have to ask, is it a good model? Is it comfortably explaining our phenomenon? So that's why I added the uncomfortably explained standard models. And if our models are better constructed, then we have a better understanding of the phenomena and possibly policy. So if I build a model, so this is the Milton Friedman dictum. If you build a model and it makes good predictions, then you have a good model. Okay, so that's one thing that a good model does. But that model won't necessarily tell you how to intervene in that situation. If your premise is wrong, then you try and take that model and you try and do something, make some prediction about how a policy may affect actions, but your model is not matching in some sense what's really going on, then you don't have a good model to evaluate policy. So models don't only have to give good predictions, they also have to somehow match the environment so that we can use that model if we're interested in, say, policy or understanding how, for example, the different moving parts of that model would change the outcomes. Okay. So what I'm going to do is actually start with a model, okay, and run through an identity model and show you those things. Show you that we can generate better predictions better predictions than a standard model, or more comfortably explained than a standard model, and how we can use that model to get some handle on policy. And so the model I'm going to be presenting here is a model of education and schooling. And what I want to do is introduce an identity framework to an economic model of identity and schooling.
These are very general, high-level observations you're making about models.
Right.
Now, we are used in, when we think about models and we think about science, we are used to falsifiability.
Yes.
And so how does what you're saying relate to a more traditional notion of how models in science work? How do you think about the relationship? Because there's a reasonably well-known way of thinking about this.
Sure. Well, I would say that you could construct, as we know, there's a critique of the falsibility dictum, but I won't go into that, right? We need infinitely, in many cases, we need an enormous amount of information in order to really be able to falsify any model. But leaving that aside, the same points that we should be able, or we should construct empirical studies and experimental studies to confront these models and ask whether or not, under certain circumstances, under certain conditions, the predictions of the model hold and the predictions of the model don't hold, absolutely hold for this too. And I will be getting in my lecture to experiments and to empirical work. So absolutely, we should be confronting these models with the same kind of rigor and criticisms that we would confront any model.
What is comfortably? Does it mean possible?
Oh, okay. So that comfortable was meant as, well, put it this way. I think okay, this is a really good question. There's a little bit of an aesthetic to economic modeling, as we know, and
I thought that's all there was to it.
Yeah, well, there you go. Okay, so if you said that, then the question is what is the aesthetic? And there's some aesthetic which we know and we've been trained in and we sort of understand, and it's that kind of aesthetic. And I think I'm sort of countering the idea that the aesthetic is only prediction. Right? We actually tell stories with our models. So, and those stories somehow have to, I don't know how many referee reports you've written that do the following. Really nice model, have no idea what it's about. Right? We somehow want a mapping between the model and the environment. Okay? And that's this aesthetic and this comfortableness which I'm talking about. And again, I don't have anything more rigorous to say about that at the moment. Okay? All right. So maybe this illustration will get a little bit at it for us. Okay. So a basic model of education, where you're talking about kids, high school kids, investing in their schooling. We understand that the basic model is an investment in human capital. So we all talk about human capital investment and human capital achievement. So in a basic model, each individual would have some sort of ability. Let's call that NI. And they have marketable skills or payoffs from their choice of effort in school. Let's call that EI. And here is what they would possibly earn. Their marketable skills that they generate from their effort in school. There's cost of effort or opportunity cost of effort, and then they gain these marketable skills and they earn some money. Okay, and individuals would choose the optimal level of schooling or effort, balancing these costs and benefits. Okay, that's the basic model of human capital acquisition. Let's ask a question. Is this a good model of children or adolescents? So this is sort of where I get to this aesthetic. Does this model kids? Does it model 13-year-olds? I don't think it's a really good model of 13-year-olds, at least most 13-year-olds. Maybe some of them do this. So the identity model is to say, okay, let's actually think about a child or an adolescent as the decision maker. Okay? Let's think about the child or the adolescent as the decision maker and what are their motives to do well in school or to exert effort in school. Okay? So here I'm going to build a model of high school in America. Okay, so can I see the people who've been through high school in America in the room? Okay, so it's a very small number, as to be expected. So what is remarkable is how common the high school experience is across the United States. And some of you, who's watched Glee? You know Glee? Glee? Okay, any program on American high school, some popular MTV programs, you know, the cheerleaders, the jocks, the people walking around with the lockers, it's all true. Okay, it's all there in these American high schools, even in Berkeley, actually.
It's also the Big Bang Theory.
The what? I don't.
It's about the ditch history.
You haven't seen the Big Bang Theory?
No. Oh, my goodness. Well, I'm out of it, clearly. I mean, okay. Oh, I think
that is an American program we
have
been seeing.
Oh, okay. So I think I know this one. This is about the Caltech. Yeah.
I don't know where it sounds like.
Look. Okay. Yes. Okay. So again, it's sort of remarkable, even in Berkeley. You know, this is true. And maybe there's some, school on, maybe Stuyvesant in New York City isn't like, sort of, not like this. Okay. All right. So I'm going to build a model of high school in America. Okay? And I'm going to illustrate, again, how if we build a model where we're actually thinking about the decision makers themselves and what their motives are, we're going to generate different predictions from a standard model and a model that's going to help us get a handle on the implications of policy. Okay, so that is in some sense this filling out what I mean by comfortable or uncomfortable. Okay, so I want to run this model through. I want to see its predictions. I want to see if we introduce a policy, are we understanding what's going on a bit better? Okay, so I'm going to have a large population of students, and each individual has two exogenously given characteristics. So now in our model, our individual has this academic ability, and they also have something that I'm going to call looks. Okay? They're good look, whatever that is, looks, good looking or not good looking. And as before, there's marketable skills. You generate marketable skills from your effort in school, and you get these payoffs that are from choice and ability. So that's there. But now we also have among our population these social categories. Now we have three of them. One of them is called the leading crowd. I don't know, the cool kids. A leading crowd is kind of a really really geeky kind of word for them. But the kids who are considered the popular cool kids. Sometimes in high schools, people would just even have a really shorthand for this. The good kids. Good. Is he good? Meaning, is he popular or is she popular? Then there's the nerds. We all know who the nerds are. Then there are the burnouts, which are the kids who sort of hang out by the lockers. They smoke, maybe, which is some sort of deviant behavior. Now they're goth. Whatever it is, it changes. So these are the burnouts. Okay. And there are norms and ideals for these folks. So if you want to be in the leading crowd, the sort of coolest person in the leading crowd is really good looking. Right? Okay. And the nerds, you have to be really smart to be a nerd. Okay? Or that's the ideal, right? That's what defines a leading crowd person is somebody who knows how to dress and knows how to walk. There's socioeconomics all behind this, but we're leaving that aside for now. And associated with these groups are norms for efforts in school. So the nerds should work hard, the leading crowd a little bit less hard, and the burnouts really shouldn't work at all. They should just be, in fact, disrupting things. That's what they should be doing. Okay, so these are treated as exogenous, right? And where we're coming from, why do I model this way, is because we've read hundreds of ethnographies of American high schools, and it's consistent. Okay, and we can talk about where these norms come from, and we can talk about the endogeneity of this ideal, but for now they're just taken as given.
Are you assuming that there is another fourth group which normal people?
No, no.
Which I guess it makes it like 80% of the group.
Oh no, so the people, so I will have people not wanting to be wannabes. So a want to be is a wannabe. And they're people who sort of don't fit in any one of these crowds, and they're kind of, right. So is it 80%? We've got the people who are on the edges of these groups, right? So that's who I've got in the model. You could have a fourth catch-all person because you sort of reject all of these groups, and of course there's some of those. But in some sense, you sort of divide up the social space in this way. You could add a fourth category, or you can add a fifth. Doesn't matter. Okay. So identity utilities depend on category, effort, and a fit with ideal. So now I'm going to build up a utility that depends on who I am and how I fit, with the ideal for my chosen category and for the effort which I exert. So remember I talked about being Hispanic. If I'm Hispanic, do I feel good about myself? Well, if I think of myself as being one of these popular kids, do I really fit in? Do I do what popular kids do? And that can generate utility.
Is there an ideal for burnouts?
Is there an ideal for the burnouts? Yeah. No. The burnouts, again, is, in some sense, they're a little, no. There is no, no ideal in terms of L and N, but there's an ideal effort. Okay. And so this is a really simple formulation of identity utility. If I'm in category C, this is sort of the self-image identity I get. And then there's a lost, the extent to which my personal attribute differs from the ideal, right? And this is this is the divergence from my own effort and the ideal for the category. Okay, so if I want to be in the leading crowd, but I'm not really good looking, it's going to feel uncomfortable. That's what that means. And if I'm in the leading crowd and I don't, do a lot, if I sort of work really hard in school, that's weird too. All right. And then there's this actually you don't need, but here it is that the social status in the schools, the leading crowd has higher status than the nerds, which has higher status than the burnouts. Okay. But you don't really need that. It's there. These are parameters you can move around. Okay, so what do individuals do in this model? They choose simultaneously effort and category. So here I am, a kid in this high school, and I say, where do I fit in? So again, getting back to what are kids thinking about? Kids are thinking about, where do I fit in? And a lot of parents spend a lot of time saying, it doesn't matter where you fit in, just work hard, right? But kids are thinking about, where do I fit in? Where do I feel comfortable? So, and then when they're thinking about where they fit in and where they feel comfortable, they're thinking about, sort of this, how they fit into these different categories, and then their effort choice is also going to help them fit in with that particular category. So they're balancing payoffs. Perhaps they have in mind their payoffs from future earnings. Maybe they still have it in their mind. You could parameterize that, put a weight on it. They balance the payoffs from effort in school with fitting into the category. So what emerges from this model? The low L students and the low N students choose to be a B, right? They don't fit in with the leading crowd. They don't fit in with the nerds, right? And so they don't want to sort of be these hangers-on. So this is kind of my catch-all category. I could put two catch-all categories. The people who aren't really the burnouts, who are really disrupting the school, but there's the kids who just say, I'm not going to fit in. I don't want to be a wannabe, So you're in that category. So these guys choose to be Bs. Now the high L students and the high N students choose to be L rather than N. So this is kind of interesting. If you have a high N, right? So you're really a smart kid, but because the social status of the school is such that the leading crowd is, they're the cool kids, and you can fit, you might choose to do that rather than be a nerd. Okay? And that kid is going to have lower academic achievement than otherwise. So these identity payoffs can lead to lower academic achievement. Okay, because basically what the kids are doing is they're trading off, as opposed to the academic achievement they would achieve, well, as opposed to the effort that they would do in school if they were just thinking about the returns to marketable skills, they're now thinking about these social categories and where they fit in.
So T is the desire to conform.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's another parameter you can move up and down, this T of the desire to conform. Okay? All right, so now I have this model, this identity model of an American high school. Okay, guys, does this sound familiar? Okay, so you might say, well, that's not, that's not evidence. But again, you kind of have to take the social context. In order to build these models, you study the social context, you rely on anthropologists, you rely on sociologists. Again, I'm an American. This is something that I can understand very well. I would hesitate to write down this model for another country unless I knew the context very well or had a co-author. The thing is you really want to build this and you want to be attentive to the context. Okay? So the identity payoffs lead to lower academic achievement.
Is it a general result that you will think about modeling identity differently, putting it in a continuous thinking about different utility functions from identity?
Oh, no, no. Am I saying this is a general result?
I'm asking.
About which is a general result?
Identity payoffs leads to lower academic achievements.
No, this is a specific model, absolutely. So if you have Stuyvesant, what I'm going to now do is introduce an intervention and see what happens. And now the identity payoffs can help you. It's going to possibly help the school administration get higher academic achievement.
Okay, so this is good. And
you can also...
Let's even fix the specification that
Yeah.
you have in the model of
Right.
identity, but let's think about the different utility function from identity.
Yep.
With the same reasonable specification of utility function, can I actually get a reversed result?
Oh, no, so I should say some of these people are overachieving. So the nerds are overachieving. So you can get overachieving people too. So the lower one was meant for the, so the nerds, some of the nerds are actually overachieving. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can get overachievement and underachievement.
Okay.
Yeah. It's just, this bullet point should be different than the economically optimal one, the one that we would predict from our human capital model.
And if you put the kind of identity, if I chose to be a nerd being ahead of, I choose to be a leading crowd, then both of those categories would overachieve. Right, so
yeah, so I've specified a bunch of things here.
So if you switch the
Yeah, you can switch these around and so on, right? Yeah.
I was thinking the I at the bottom, if the I end was big.
Yeah, exactly. So when the nerds become the lead, like this is in Stuyvesant, which is this magnet school in New York City. So that's what I'm talking about. You switch these around.
Produces economists at MIT.
Right. Okay, so now what I want to do is say, okay, so now I have this model, and now I'm going to introduce a policy. And let's see how far, again, I'm going to argue that this model that's enhanced with this identity utility will give us a better understanding of how this policy will affect the academic achievement of these kids. Okay? All right. So now that's a school policy to affect academic achievement by changing the student social arrangements. Okay? So you have this principal or a school district that is enlightened or whatever and wants to actually change the student achievement level. And here's the policy. They introduce athletics into a high school. So now you have to imagine an American high school without the athletics and then bring them in. Because of course athletics are ubiquitous in American high schools. Okay? So now imagine the American high school without the football team and then bring in the football team. Okay, that's the exercise here. Okay, so this is actually a policy. There's a lot of money that goes into high school sports. Okay, this is a policy. So now we've introduced a new social category. Let's call them the jocks. And the jocks are part of this leading crowd because Americans love sports and Americans value, they put a high value on athletics. Again, that's part of it. So I should say that there's this wonderful sociology of American high schools by Coleman. And the way it's from the 50s and 60s. And the way he describes it is that these high schools are a mirror, a slightly distorted mirror of the larger society, right? Okay. So now we've introduced jocks. And students have another characteristic. In addition to N and L, they have an A. They're possibly athletic. You know, they have something about themselves which they can really perform well in sports. So now students are now again going to make this choice between categories and effort. Sorry, I didn't say that right. They're simultaneously making a choice between category and effort, and for one category and effort for another category. So I'm deciding to be a nerd, I'm deciding to be a jock, I'm deciding to be a burnout, and given that I've decided to be a jock, what is the effort that I pick, given my identity utility there? So what would be the results? The high A, right? There is a pointer here. Which one is it?
The middle.
The middle. Okay.
The big one.
Thank you. The high A, so the high athletic folks, but the low N and the low N students now choose to be Ls. Remember, the jocks are part of L, so they choose to be jocks, so they're part of the middle, the leading crowd. So this is actually a big deal in a lot of American high schools. So what you do is you get the kids who, particularly the not very bright kids, the kids who don't fit in very well. By the way, low L here, this is the looks, remember? That is possibly a socioeconomic thing. You don't have the money to get the clothes, you don't have the stuff, you don't know how to sort of act in this way. This is bringing in kids, this is bringing in the Hispanic kids in Texas into the high school because they're on the football team. Okay? That's what this is doing. And in fact, you even put rules on participation in football. You have to get certain grades in order to stay on the football team. And so this gets the kids doing at least some effort in school. So that is a policy. Again, the school has introduced this policy and is bringing kids into the school, getting them involved in the community of the school, feeling more attached to the school, and they're achieving more in the school. But there's this other effect, is that suppose you're really a smart kid, but you're also a really good athlete. Right? And this kid will now choose to be in the leading crowd rather than a nerd. So now you have the kid who is really smart and is very athletic, and they want to be on the football team rather than be a nerd. So you get, right, here you can see that these identity payoffs are, again, moving you away from the economic, what would be the economic outcome, and overall you could have an increase or decrease in academic achievement by the introduction of this policy. And so there's less, though there is less divergence, excuse me, in academic treatment. You have fewer Bs, but also you have fewer Ns. You're sort of, by adding this possibility, you've sort of taken away from the extremes. So it's a little bit of a, okay, so I'll say that. So what I wanted to run through this, I wanted to run through this model. It's obviously a very simple, stylized model. But again, why I'm running through it is to show you that if you take a standard economic model of academic achievement, this human capital model, you would miss all of this. This wouldn't be in there at all. What would high school athletics do? They would simply take money away from the classrooms. That's all that they would be doing. Right? And you should just not have them. Now, some people could argue that, right? But it's missing all of what exactly is this particular policy doing, possibly doing within American high schools. Yeah.
When you said that the characteristics were independently distributed, there was some correlation between the different abilities, like maybe you're good looking and you're more likely to be good at sports if you're good looking or something.
Well, sure, you could build all of that in. It's not necessarily going to change this result here. We wrote down something very simple. I think one could certainly do that. I think what sort of is coming on the next slide actually is what does it mean to be part of this leading crowd? So I kind of hinted that there's socioeconomics involved in that too, right? Do you have the money to get the right clothes, dress the right way, and so on? So yes, that could all be embellished. I'm making actually a very simple point at the moment is that if you introduce identity utility, you're going to open up, right, the model to all of these different possibilities that we actually think are operative at least in American high schools, okay, or American schools. Okay, so now I'm just going to give a hint of what you could do. So suppose you have a population with different ethnic and social groups, And here, this is also a big debate in the United States. The curriculum is thought to favor one of the groups. So as you might know, in the United States, the curriculum is decided by each locality. There is no, well, that's a whole other debate. There's this whole debate over something called the Common Core. But anyway, each locality decides its curriculum. And now, for example, some states are saying, no, we're not going to adopt the Common Core, and a particular school board in a particular town could decide they're not going to do anything that is recommended by the state. So it's very, very locally decided. And there's debates about the curriculum. So now, and there's debates about whether the curriculum, for example, will favor certain groups. What literature do you read? Okay, actually, what science you teach, but that's another story. So suppose the curriculum is thought to favor one of the groups, but unfortunately, marketable skills and identity payoffs depend on effort at mastering this curriculum. So if you want to get into a good college, you actually do have to read The Sun Also Rises. Okay, you have to read it. And you have to be able to write an essay on it. But if you read The Sun Also Rises, what does that say about me as a person? That I'm actually making effort to, read that book and write about it. So the school policy in this case could be affecting achievement by changing the curriculum to affect the identity payoffs of effort. So this is the adoption of, say, courses in African American literature. Right? So the canon which students are supposed to master is not just The Sun Also Rises, but it's also The Color Purple and various other masterpieces of African American literature. Okay? And in fact, we can pick up this issue in statistics on students' attitude towards classes. And again, this is really light empirical work. But we just took a look at high school and beyond. High school and beyond is a survey of American high school students. And we looked at their attitudes towards math classes and English classes. Okay? And students, I guess, let me see if I can give you one statistic. Students, if you're a black student in a white school, because we know the schools are very segregated, and there's very few schools that are actually, have a mix of, like a 50-50 split. There's very few of those schools. If you're a black student in a white school, you dread going to English class, but you don't dread going to math class, for example. Okay, and you can get the reverse too, with white kids and black class. So again, here's a notion that so all we're doing here is picking up in the statistics stuff that you read every day in your newspapers about debates over curriculum. And I should say there's this unbelievably interesting work by how many authors? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 authors. This wonderful new paper. I'm highlighting this to show that there is empirical work being done in this area, right? So, George and I wrote this stuff a while ago, but now we're seeing serious people engaging these issues with policy and with experiments and so on. This is an effort in Chicago to, in Chicago in African American neighborhoods where there's an extraordinarily underachievement, especially of the male high school students. And the policy intervention is twofold, is introduce intense tutoring, right? 1-on-2 tutoring, a tutor and 2 students, I believe it is. Really intense tutoring, I believe an hour a day or an hour every other day. And this program called Becoming a Man. This program of Becoming a Man is, BAM, is to somehow teach these men, these young men, how they can be men, or it's okay to be a man, without being so aggressive towards each other, right? And I don't know the ins and outs of this policy, of this intervention, but it's all about not necessarily having to punch the other guy. It's, saying, so I think one of the exercises they do is say, one of the first things they do is, so I would tell, try and get me to open my fist. And so the first reaction is to try to pull it apart and so forth, and they say, why don't you just ask her or him? Okay, so that's, again, I'm not an expert on this Becoming a Man program. These guys have studied the effect of this program. It's a very small sample. It's tutoring and becoming a man, and they see a significant effect of the becoming a man, okay, independent of the tutoring. So I think it's math. I think that's what this is in. But again, we can all check this. It's an NBR working paper. Okay. All right. So I wanted to run you through, hold on, I wanted to run you through this modeling and end up with a current policy, right, to show you how that when you think about students and when you think about people and the motivations that they may be having, their social context in which they're living, that we may have a better understanding of what's going on and may be able to construct better policies. Yeah.
In your first model, the group was the choice variable, right? But that's hard to imagine for example, ethnic groups.
Right, right. So that is, so it's a constrained choice, or it's actually not, one could write it down as a constrained choice. I actually have it in here. So I am endowed with an L, okay? And that L may be further or closer to the ideal for the leading crowd. So if L equals 1 is the ideal for the leading crowd, and L equals 0.02, that's my endowed L, then I can try and be that kind of person, but I'm never really going to pass. I'm never really going to make it. So I don't choose to be that way. So so the fact that I have an initial endowment, right, or my own, initial characteristics, in some sense, I give people some choice, but in the end they don't make that choice because they'll never be able to actually conform or segregate or integrate or whatever you want to call that. And in other models, we're going to have something which is there. So you can say I don't allow choice at all. Right, but we do know that some people do try, and we do know that people will, there is the phenomenon in the African American community, for example, of passing. It's a phenomenon, right, of people who are very light-skinned but come from an African American community. This is way back, sort of at the end of the Civil War when the blacks migrated to the north. So we could do it without choice whatsoever. We've added some choice, but there's also this initial endowment of characteristic. Okay? Yeah.
But sometimes you can do all the right things and still not be allowed in.
Yes, I have that in another model. That's in my minority poverty model. There's going to be a real cost that you face, and that could be getting beaten up, right? So yeah, you could get beaten up by trying to do this as well. So
in some groups, the smaller they are, the more value they have, right?
So again, I don't have endogenous group size here. It'd be another thing you could do. So. Right, so in another model I have if you try and be in a group to which you don't really fit, then there's this real cost that others impose on you. So that is also, could be going on. So again, I'm running through this model to give you a sense of how you can, again, start with the standard model, add the social environment, get a model which matches the environment better, and get a better understanding of policy. Yeah?
One question. So it comes to my mind this work of Andrew Postlewhite and George Millet, in which they say, okay, instead of assuming that there is a change, incorporating the social framework into the deep preferences, is there any non-market institution that could explain exactly the same behavior but without assuming something on the deep preferences?
So as I said in the beginning, any economist worth his or her salt, and I would count Postlewhite and Millet among them, can build a model that will get this from pure standard assumptions. So it can get anything you want. Okay? And the question is getting to this aesthetic of comfortable or not. So yeah, of course. And in fact, I would want you to be able to.
I would have thought that you would actually make a stronger case.
Okay, well.
That it actually may be more parsimonious.
That is, so, yeah, so there.
In a sense, it involves fewer contortions and
yes.
less repeated games.
Well,
monitoring.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to put that up later. So I made this argument in the very beginning of the first week. I think our identity models are more parsimonious than these other models, which are, have lots and lots of bells and whistles, which could get you this, similar kinds of trade-offs and results. Parsimony, also, that we know, is in the eyes of the beholder, right? Some people say that parsimonious has to be based on preferences, constraints, and technology, and you're not allowed to fiddle with preferences. Preferences have to be over consumption and income. So basically, I'm fiddling with preferences. And so some people would say that's not parsimonious. I say it is. Okay, so again, parsimony is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, of what they understand by the word parsimony. But I think we have few moving parts here. Yes?
So I was thinking you kind
Oh, sure, absolutely. So, yes, so the idea here is that people possibly can have different identities and possibly different identities at different times, so people can switch, so they can act one way in one context and act one way in another context. In fact, we all do that. We're acting one way in this room, we act a different way when we go home, we act a different way when we're riding a bus. So people, so the big, one of the big dichotomies people often talk about is, professional women, right? So I'm supposed to act one way in the workplace, I'm supposed to act another way with my spouse, another way with my children, and so on. So absolutely, that is part of this identity package. And you could build, again, you could build that in. Currently, we have not built such things in to models. I don't know of a model out there, literally, of this multiple identity. It's a little bit like the time inconsistency models, but again, it hasn't been done formally, but absolutely, you guys want to write a model like that and see its implications for voting behavior, for example, it would be fantastic. Okay, so I want to move on a little bit to inequality. Okay, so now I want to sort of relate, oh, sorry, go ahead.
But as far as I understood, when we actually do this, it kind of superimposes each other. So on one hand, you have this decision either to be a nerd or a leading crowd or so on. On the other hand, you have your ethnic attachment. It it's not necessarily mutually, it's kind of adds on the top. So it's subclass of which category?
Yes and no. So I'm going to be talking later. So again, this model is very stark. It's very simplistic in some sense. But in some sense, it's also very rich because it brings in a whole social world that was non-existent in these models before. So what you're saying is you want to actually make this model a bit more complex and allow the leading crowd, for example, to have subdivisions. You can be the cool black kid, or you can be the cool Hispanic kid, or whatever it might be. And indeed, and this is something that's coming up, I don't know, previewing some things I'm just going to talk about, is that there are people who are trying to do that. There are people who are trying to say, you know what? Being black does not mean getting a C. Being black means getting an A, right? To change what we understand by the norms, to change what we understand by the leading crowd, and so on. So all of this is the dynamics that we can start to understand if we have this framework. Okay. So now I want to just say something about this whole conversation that we're all having about inequality. So, basic idea about basic understanding of inequality, and this is, with all due respect to everyone who studies the metrics of inequality. Some people have more and some people have less. Okay, so why do we care? Okay, why do we care about that? Okay, so as social scientists, we're curious. And we want to understand why we see such patterns. So one of the big questions that people say, I remember way back in a macro class, one of the biggest puzzles why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. Right? Okay. That was a big puzzle that I was taught to, we were out to solve in macro, and when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. So some people have more and some people less. Why do we care about it? Well, first, as social scientists, we're curious. We want to understand such patterns. But why inequality per se as a pattern of interest? Well, maybe it's bad for growth. A lot of people talk it's bad for growth, it's bad for economic development, and we're interested in that. Right? And so we know there's a huge discussion now about inequality, right? And about concentration of wealth among certain folks and so on. Maybe it's bad for the trajectory of growth and so on. But maybe also we look at out there and we say this somehow isn't right. It's unfair that some people have so much more and some people have so much less. Maybe it's unjust. And I actually think we might want to include that in our reasons for studying such patterns. And personally, I also think it's particularly unjust when these inequalities are systematic in the sense that certain groups have more and certain groups have less. It's not that there's this random distribution among ethnicities and people of different skin colors and genders and, some people have more and some people less and it's randomly distributed. No, there's some sort of systematic way in which people have more and people have less. So in the United States, again, we can think about blacks and Hispanics. In Europe, we can think about North Africans, Africans, the Roma. In many parts of the world, and in the United States, women, right, have a lot less than men and earn a lot less than men. And in many parts of the world, women can't even work. And they can't even go to work. All right. So I want to see whether, so now what I'm going to be talking about is whether identity can help us understand such patterns of inequality. So I just don't want to think about wealth being concentrated in the hands of the few. I want to think about the poor people and why they are who they are. Okay? So at a minimum, identity is a designator of a social group. So how does identity figure into inequality? Is a mere descriptor? It's just a description of a person. Or is these identity and the social categories and the norms a part of the process that creates and sustains inequality? So here I'm just going to run through what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk. I'm going to talk about the economic theory of identity and inequality. I'm going to go through two specific models. I'm going to tell you a little bit about experiments. So for example, there's a lot to do about, so we heard a lot about preferences for fairness or an equity version or whatever you want to call these things. Do people have preferences for inequality? And the answer turns out to be yes. Okay. And then I want to get to some empirical work. Can we see the economic effects and identity on policy and preferences, and can we see some inequality notions here? So can we see the effects on of identity on economics, particularly inequality? So here I might be pushing a little bit, but I have a study that I'm going to tell you about from the University of Chicago on gender. Right? Okay, and that's where we're going. Okay, so before I launch into a little bit more of the contrast between the identity approaches and other approaches, let me see if there are questions.
So how much of this work, so I haven't seen your slides, so how much of this work is sort of done and published, etc.? How can we access it? Are you going to give us some idea about how we can access this work? Is it all available?
Oh, I have a reading.
Slides, the references?
Oh, I have a reading list.
Okay, good. So it's all.
Yeah, the reading list is all there. I might be that the Becoming a Man paper might not be on the reading list, just because I added a few, I was tweaking, right? So I added a few things at the last minute. But all of this stuff, there's a reading list, which I've given to the organizers. Okay, so this is about theory, okay? And since it's about theory, and since with this whole discussion about parsimony and the role of models has come up, I want to advertise this book. So this book is an economic theorist book of tales. It's by George Akerlof. And it's a book it's a collection of, I think, 8 to 10 of his articles. Of course, you should read the articles, but you should read the introduction to this book. It's the introduction to this book which I think gives a good guide to what is the purpose of modeling in economics. And it's about how, in some sense, these models, it doesn't really go into parsimony and falsifiability and all of these things which we think are these rigid criteria, which in some sense all in the end are very hard to pin down. It talks about how to build a good model, about something that's of economic interest and why we model in that sense. And so I just suggest it for reading. It's very light reading, and it's the introduction to that book. Okay. This was a late tweak. Okay, so why are we thinking about theory in terms of, again, this is the theory as applied to identity, theory as applied to inequality. Okay, so if we're looking at socioeconomic outcomes and we're thinking about the unequal, say, wealth or different levels of academic achievement or all of these different variables of interest, there's often in these regressions in these studies some sort of dummy variable where you may have black, female, ethnicity, region, state, right? You may have interaction effects, black females, white males, and so forth. You have these interaction effects. And there are these dummy variables which are in these equations. And again, just to fix ideas, if we look at education, we see that systematically a child or adolescent underachieves, so black children in the United States, so these are the same list I gave before, Roma children in Hungary, girls in developing countries. What can account for the dummy variables and these interaction effects? So theory is going to help us unpack these dummy variables. Okay, we want to understand not just that there is a difference among these groups, but why. Okay. So what I'm going to run through are 3 different ways to unpack this black box, which are just 3 different approaches to what we could generally call social norms that may be underlying these particular, these particular findings. Okay? So in a basic economic model, individuals have utility from their own choices and actions. They have idiosyncratic preferences, which are exogenous, and there's technology and constraints. And these choices lead to patterns of behavior. So somehow, the reason for this dummy variable, the reason for this effect has to come from one of these 3 things. It has to come from utility preferences, utility constraints, and technology. They're kind of mixed up in that list. Okay? Now we can add to that strategic interaction, so that this was on the individual level. Now we can add to that strategic interaction, so now people are interacting with each other. So individuals have payoffs from own and others' actions. They have these payoff functions, which are given to be exogenous. There's some sort of game form, which are the institutions. They specify the information asymmetry, and then we have an equilibrium. So now we have an equilibrium, which gives patterns of behavior, and we say, aha, that's the reason. Okay? It's because people are in this equilibrium that we see this particular outcome. Now, we can also think about preferences themselves as determining the utility and the payoff. So you think about the basic economic model and the strategic interaction model. We can start thinking about the ingredients to those models, which one of the ingredients is the preferences. Okay? The preferences which are determining the utilities in the basic economic model and the payoffs in the strategic interaction model. So we're not the first to have played with preferences, right? Gary Becker played with preferences. Okay? He put in his models of utility that people like and don't like different things. Okay? So we're building on that in some sense. So we have people like and don't like different things, but also people should and shouldn't do certain things. So there's a normative notion to our preferences. Okay? And another thing is that these should and shouldn't do's are not randomly distributed in the population. They're associated with these ethnicities and social categories and genders. And then if we think about the utility and the preferences differently, and we combine it with the technology and constraints for the basic economic model and strategic interaction of sort of the game theoretic choices, you now have the choices and equilibria give you the patterns of behavior. Okay, so this is how you add things to these standard models. So if we were going to go through this in terms of education, so I'm going to go through them one at a time. So I've actually, I don't want to say that we should throw out the basic model. We can get a lot from these basic models, right? So I'm going to go through them one at a time. The basic model, the strategic interaction model, just sort of give you an overview, and then how these sort of identity models add. Because we don't want to throw out the basic models. They can actually tell us an enormous amount too. All right, so in a basic economic model, we start out with an individual with exogenous idiosyncratic preferences. This person makes these choices given the technology and the constraint. So here's how it would work in a schooling example. A child likes or not school, or is more or less talented at schoolwork. So this is this little NI that I had in my previous model. This child weighs the costs and benefits of schooling, given the school quality and opportunity costs of attending school, job networks, discrimination, and so on. And we may see from this basic model a pattern that African Americans have lower levels of academic achievement because they attend worse schools. And they do have worse job networks. That's all true, right? We shouldn't forget those things, too. Right? We also see that girls may have a lower level of academic achievement because they have a high opportunity cost of time. They're supposed to work at home. They're supposed to take care of the little kids. Right? So in many countries of the world, girls drop out, right? Sometimes because the schools don't accommodate them, but also because they have to be doing work at home. So there's a high opportunity cost of time that's differential between boys and girls. Again, really important to recognize that. So again, these models are useful because such technology and constraints may exist, right? But I will say, it still begs the question is, why do blacks attend worse schools? Why are they less well-funded, right? Why should women or girls attend to the household chores? Why is that pattern there? No, maybe that there's another level of technology and constraints behind that, the agricultural technology and so on, right? But we still should be questioning where this technology and constraints come from. So there's a basic model, again, utility, preference, which is the preferences, technology and constraints. We can get a lot from those models, but we also should be digging deeper. Okay, now let's do strategic interaction. So now we have people interacting with each other. They're not just individuals in this large marketplace or this large community. So individual payoffs now depend on own preferences and others' actions. Oh, so own actions, others' actions, and preferences. And you make choices strategically, taking into account how others react. And you come up with, you find the equilibrium of this model. And this equilibrium, you say, aha, that's the social pattern that we see. So for example, you can write down a repeated game where people punish those who violate the equilibrium action. And there's lots of models out there where you have multiple equilibria, and some equilibria are good, and some equilibria are bad. So we can write down a signaling game. I'm going to go through one later where the actions indicate some underlying unobserved attribute, and the equilibrium, meaning the signal that people send, is is a social norm, right? This is how these models go. I'll give you an example later. And then we add labels to those things, and we have a theory, suppose. So, so for example, in the first one, so a repeated game version of this, let's do the repeated game. You can easily build a model where girls invest less in school because they will face worse marriage prospects. It's just a simple social punishment, you know? There's an equilibrium that if you invest more in school, then you'll be punished. It's just like, it's just like having a bad equilibrium in a prisoner's dilemma. In a repeated one of the outcomes of a repeated prisoner's dilemma game is that everybody defects. Okay? So you can easily build a repeated game model where you sustain different norms because people are worried about future punishment. And if if the punisher doesn't punish, then they get punishment and so on. Of course, there's a beautiful paper by George Akerlof on this before the game theory revolution about caste. Okay. About the signaling game, and this is a model I'm going to go through a little bit more carefully. You can write down a signaling game where African Americans don't achieve in school because it reveals they are dedicated to providing public goods to a community. So there's underlying attributes that different people have. If they don't invest in schooling, it's revealing their type. Their type is that they're willing to invest, or they enjoy the public goods provided by the community, and they'll stay in the community. Okay? So again, you can build these models, right, where you have some sort of strategic interaction between people, and you can explain or give some insight onto these patterns of behavior. So the inequality that is generated from these models is some kind of capricious, maybe that's too strong a word, outcome of strategic interaction. There's really no social context per se, right? There's nothing particularly meaningful in these models, maybe meaningful, socially meaningful in these models about being black, female, North African, whatever it is. However, I don't want to throw out these models completely, right? It still could be useful, right? Social norms may indeed be bad equilibria. I don't want to say that none of these social norms and seeing these particular patterns of behavior, they could be bad equilibria. And how do we get out of bad equilibria? There's some sort of intervention. So people argue that the civil rights law in the United States was actually such an intervention. Okay, that the employers in the South were stuck in this really bad equilibria. They all wanted to hire African American labor because it was cheap, right? But there was all of this social punishment that was going on. So there's some papers by Golden and Katz that argue that, I hope I got that right, that the civil rights law was actually something that a lot of employers welcomed because it got them out of this very bad equilibrium. Okay, all right. So again, this view may be very useful. But before we just say, great, we're done, I want to consider three basic points. Okay? The theoretical requirements to sustain equilibrium in these models are very strong. You have to have sort of this punishment of punishers, or I'm sure you can do this. You build in some incomplete information, you build in all of other stuff. You can do that, but it's how many bells and whistles do you want to add to completely sustain, to have this norm be sustained. Okay? And here's where, again, I want to push this, this broader approach. If we actually look at the civil rights law, for example, you know, I'm going to argue we can't ignore the social context. There's a lot of discussion in the society about these norms and arguments and debates and passion, right? So civil rights law was not just some policy intervention that dropped from a helicopter onto the south of the United States, right? There was a huge, I mean, okay, we can all go read about it, right? It was obviously enormously controversial, all sorts of political intrigues and insights and so on. And we women are very happy because women were added to that law. They didn't think it would matter, but we're really happy that it's actually in there. But that was not the point then, right? Maybe that's, okay. So one is that, you know, the interventions come from somewhere, and I really want to push this point. People die over these issues, okay? People fight and die over interventions, over norms, over preserving norms, over changing norms, right? This is something that, you know, if you want to think about the ultimate sacrifice, right? People fight and die over these issues. So I do think that we should take this seriously, is that we don't want to just write down models that are based on fixed preferences, technology, and constraints. Because people are going to fight to change those constraints, people may be fighting to change that technology, and people debate and fight over the preferences also. You shouldn't think that way. Who do you think you are to act that way? And so on. Okay. All right. So with that impassioned introduction, let's get to preference and norms are a possible source of inequality. So if we go back to Becker, there's a taste-based theory of discrimination. In the same way, people like apples and other people like oranges. Some people may not want to work with blacks or women. So that's the kind of Becker way of doing things. It's such like apples and oranges, it's blacks and women, and people have tastes. And then employers might not want to hire people in these groups because workers with these tastes would require a wage premium and so on. We all know how this works. So blacks and women would then not want to get an education. But we all know that in these sorts of models, competition could eliminate such high-cost firms. And the point here is that preferences per se may matter, right? But we're going to introduce the likes and the shoulds and the debate. So the preferences are not idiosyncratic. It's not just like apples and oranges, right? It's not just that some people like apples and some people like oranges. This is much, much deeper than that. It's the way we understand what we should and what we shouldn't do and what's appropriate behavior. And these preferences are socially derived, and they depend on people's identities. Okay, so there was a question back there? No. So what I want to do now is just give you a framework of the ingredients we think would be useful to have in a model that considers these socially derived preferences. Okay? So I'm just going to paint for you a sort of a basic utility function. So people have these tastes, but they also have norms for how they should behave. Let me just go right to here. Okay, so what you would want to do, this is a proposal, is you start with a standard model of utility. So the utility of person J is represented by some utility over AJ and A not J. By the way, this is already a strategic interaction model because I've got the A not J in there, right? So the payoffs of a person depends on their own actions and other people's actions. Okay, so A not J captures the possibility of externalities or strategic interaction. So we could, again, back to the schooling example. AJ is my effort in school. A not J is the effort in others in school, which may help or hurt J's academic achievement. So we have peer group effects. It's already sort of built in here. So here are the ingredients that we propose you add. A set of social category C. So you look at the context, and you think about what are the relevant social categories. Is it men? Is it women? Is it managers and workers? Okay, what is the context that you are working in? And what is the social context and social categories that are operative? We want to think about individuals then assigning themselves and others to these categories, right? So an individual is now a part of a social category. You want to think about the norms. So what are the norms that give the appropriate behavior and the ideal attributes of each social category? And now we build a utility function where there's this added term, right? This added term is I's self-image. And here I'm going to sort of run through how this could work. So this is extraordinary. I don't mean this to be, this is not operative in any way at the moment. It's just telling you what we think are the ingredients you should have in such a model. Okay? You may not have all of them, but this is a framework where one might begin. Okay, so what are those objects? Yeah.
I guess you want to
Yeah.
walk us through this.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the utility function with the identity term, and here's this identity term. So what are all of these objects? So we want to think about, this is what we're talking about when we talk about identity payoffs. So I gave you an example of this in the high school schooling. Right? I had a little baby example of such identity payoffs. Okay? So here's how it works. So overall utility depends on actions, own actions, others' actions, and how they affect the economic utility and how they affect this self-image or identity utility. Okay? So we're going to talk about that. First, how is this identity utility impacted by own and others' actions? First, you should act as you should, right? So this is the match between own actions and the norms for that category. Okay, so this is the match between how you behave and the norms for your category. Remember, there's a CJ in here, right? So this tells you what J's category is. You want to know whether this person fits in, and so this is the match between J's own attributes and the ideal of the category, and the status of the assigned category given by IJ. Okay, so you can see that this is, we operationalize that in the high school example. So in a basic case, a person chooses AJ, where is it? Let me go back. In the basic case, a person chooses AJ to maximize utility, taken as given, their category assignment, their own attributes, and the norms. So you decide, do I work hard in school, given who I am, right, and how I fit into different groups. In general, however, a person could act to change their own category, their own attributes, or societal norms. So this semicolon here is really important. So the semicolon here is, first, you can think of the basic case in the short run, people choosing AJ, right, to maximize their utility, taking into account this identity payoffs, taking as given, that's the semicolon, own category, own attributes, and the norms. But in the long run, right, people can act to change the categories and the norms for those categories, right, or the set of categories. So again, this is the debates, the marches, and, whoops, also the people out there, the third parties who have incentives to change all of these things to make money. Right? So these are the advertisers as well, who are interested in creating norms and categories because then you buy their product as well. Okay? All right. Okay, so what I want to do now, we're done at what time?
At 11, so you have about 20 minutes.
Okay, great. So before I do this, let me ask if there are any questions. What I'm going to do now is run through two specific models. So I've given you this outline of different theoretical approaches. One is this sort of basic utility model where an individual acts on their own, and they're sort of very small within the whole setting, and then this can lead to some sort of pattern of inequality. Then I can also told you there are these signaling or strategic interaction, repeated game kinds of models, right? And then there's these identity models, right? And I gave you an overview of those. So now I just want to run through two models. Specifically, they're about the same, about the same thing, right? And show you the contrast the two approaches. Okay, we're good? So the two models I'm going to do are the Austin and Fryer acting white model. Actually, yeah. So we're going to talk about worker investment in education. So I'm still doing this education kind of example, participation in the labor force or education, effort in education model. And we're going to look at two models which generate inequality. So one is inequality as an equilibrium phenomenon. So this is going to be a signaling model. This is the Austin, Smith, and Fryer acting white model. And then I'm going to give you the model that's based on identity preferences, identity and social norms, and this is the model that George and I have in our identity paper. So I want to go through both of those models so you can see the different approaches and what they do and they don't do, because, you know, again, no model can do everything. Okay. All right, so let's go through the Fryer and Smith model. Okay, so what they're doing is they're building a model of African American underachievement in schools. So that's the objective. The objective is to generate an outcome where that corresponds to the phenomenon that African Americans generally in the United States, again, underachieve in school. So the social norm is going to be an outcome of a signaling game. So the overview, and then I'll go through some of the details. So people choose an action to signal their underlying desirable attribute. Here, people are signaling their sociability by not attending school. Okay? The interpretation is that, okay, let me just go through that. Okay, so here's the model. Okay. So in this model, there's 3 sets of agents. There's individuals, firms, and there's a peer group. Okay? Individuals and firms are making decisions. The peer group is making a decision, but it's not, we don't break that down into individuals. It's just there's this peer group that's accepting or not people. Okay? So individuals have 2 hidden characteristics. Individuals have some sort of social type. They're either high or low social types. And individuals have an economic type, which is on a continuum. Okay. The distribution of these characteristics are known. So the probability that an individual is a high social type is pH. Okay. And for the economic type, there's a cumulative distribution function. So individuals are endowed, individuals have a type, that's a pair. They either are high or low sociability, and then they also have some sort of economic type. Okay? Individuals are endowed with a unit of time, and they decide how much education to obtain. So they choose how much to work in school, or what level, it's again a continuum, so how much do they work in school, or when do they drop out, and so on. So we're going to put in here the standard assumptions for a kind of Spence signaling model in education, right? So this is, these are the assumptions you would have for a Spence signaling model. The cost of education depends on the economic type, right? So the cost of education is increasing convex. So S here is the level of education. It's higher for the economic type. You have the single crossing property and so on. So you just want to think about this economic type and education just like you would in a Spence signaling model. Okay? And the cost of education do not depend on the sociability type, whether or not you're sociable or not. Okay. From the firm's point of view, the marginal product of a worker, again, only depends on the level of schooling and the economic type. So it's increasing in schooling and the economic type. There's some sort of complementarity, and that's a particular functional form you write down. It's really not very important what functional form there is. It makes it easy to work with. Firms are competitive. They're going to be paying the expected marginal product. Okay, so we've got competitive firms. So again, we've got to imagine now we have a Spence signaling model. Everything's a Spence signaling model, except that workers have this sociability type, okay, which I haven't yet talked about, except that workers have it. Okay, are you with me? There we go. That's that point. Now we're going to add a second audience, okay, and a second motivation for our workers. The peer group, there's a peer group out there that's interested in the sociability of their individual. They want to know lambda. So the peer group out there wants to know lambda. Okay? And the individual is interested in being accepted by the peer group. Okay? So an individual gains utility by being accepted into their peer group. The peer group is only interested in accepting high sociability types. And this V underbar is the peer group's, what they get if they don't accept somebody into their group. Okay, it's some lower bound on their utility. Right? So this is just some notation that will appear later. This is this assumption here is that a peer group only wants to accept a high sociability type, right? They want to reject a low sociability type. So that's all we have here. So what you want to think about is these people who are people who like hanging out. Okay, they're sociable, literally. So a peer group likes sociable people. So we just have this, this is the choice that the peer group is making. They either accept an individual into the peer group or they don't. Individuals have utility from leisure time. So this is, so let me just go back the slide here. Okay, so the peer group is interested in the sociability of the individual, and the individual may be interested in being accepted by the peer group. So the first thing here was the peer group's payoffs. The second thing here is the individual's payoffs, right, from being accepted in the peer group. You with me? So an individual that's accepted into the peer group, right, this is their leisure. So this is the amount of time that they don't spend, say, in school, and this is their utility from leisure. And it's going to be higher, right, for the higher sociability type if they're accepted. Okay, so this higher sociability type likes more being in a peer group than a low sociability type. Right, so they get more utility from leisure. That's the way you want to think about it. Okay? So overall, this is an individual's payoffs. Okay? They get their wage, and we're going to talk about how that wage is determined. The wage is going to be paid by a firm who's going to infer something about the worker's productivity. So the workers get a wage. They get their payoffs from leisure, right? This is the leisure payoffs. And these are the costs of S, schooling, given your economic type. And this is the thing that obeys the Spence assumptions, right? Increasing and convex and single crossing property. This wage is something the firms are going to pick. They're going to have a menu of wages, and then it's going to be wage is going to be some function of S, right? Because that's what the firms can observe, and the workers are going to be picking S. Okay? That's how this model works. I think I have a timeline. Where did my timeline go? Okay. My timeline's over there. It's somehow migrated. Okay, so just so we're completely clear on the timeline here, okay, so for the workers, their types are realized. And we're going to think about it as being private information. Okay, so each worker has a lambda and a phi and is private information. The workers are going to choose S, so that's what workers do. They choose S. Right? The peer group accepts or not, and firms set these wages. Okay? And hire or not. Right? So again, it's a standard Spence model, except we've added the peer group, the lambda, and that S might reveal something about lambda. Okay? Everybody good? All right. Oh, and then there's utility over here. Everyone gets utility. And payoffs. And the firms earn money. Actually, they earn zero profits. Okay, so we're going to look for a sequential equilibrium. Agents act optimally given their types and the actions of other agents, and the beliefs have to be consistent with equilibrium actions. So first, as we always do in these models, we start with a complete information benchmark, and then we're going to build up to the private information, right? So complete information, lambda and phi are known. Then we're going to make lambda unobservable, then we're going to make phi unobservable, and then we're going to make them both unobservable. Okay, so that's how the analysis goes. The firms, we're going to pay their marginal product, right? Peer group is going to accept high and rejects low sociability types. Individuals are going to choose S to maximize utility, and we're done. The one thing I should just mention here is that high sociability types are going to choose lower S, because it's optimal for them to do so. They get a lot of fun. They have a lot of fun when they hang out with their friends. Okay? They have higher returns to leisure. And this is what their utility would be. Since I'm running short on time, what I'm going to do is skip right to the complete private information case. Okay, so this is the complete information case. When I meant complete private, that was really bad. This is the complete information case. Firms and peer group can observe lambda and phi. We could then look at firms and peer group observing lambda, firms and peer group observing phi, or they can't observe either. So I'm going to jump to they can't observe either. Okay, are we good? Okay. So that's the complete information. There we go. Okay. So let's look at the case where both the economic type and the social type are not observable. The firms are going to pay according to S, right? And they're going to infer this phi from S. And the peer group are going to accept or reject also from their inference about lambda from S. Okay? So the only way the workers or our individuals here can signal their types is through one thing, which is S. Okay, so there's only one thing which they can use to signal their types. And it's to signal two things about them, both their sociability and their economic type. Okay? So in all equilibria, worker strategies will have the following form. The low sociability individuals are going to separate by phi. So you want to think about the low sociability workers as doing what they would do in a Spence model. They're going to separate by phi. Because remember, your low sociability workers could either be really talented or not. And they're going to separate, right, just as they would in a Spence model, right? Because you don't have the low, the high ability workers are going to get too much education, right? It's exactly like that, so the low types don't mimic them. But the big point is the high sociability guys. Okay. The high sociabilities are going to divide up into groups. What that means here is you're going to have, for different ranges of this, for different ranges of their economic types, they're going to be adopting different levels. And here's the big one here. For workers who have high sociability, right, but are also high economic types, they may adopt the education level of a lower education level to signal to the peer group that they're actually a high sociability type. Are you with me? So that's how it works. So that individuals who are actually high sociability, they're going to actually reduce their education level in order to signal to the peer group that they are high sociability. Okay, so you have people who are really smart but very sociable. This is the inefficiency, right? Really smart but really sociable, underachieving. Because they want to signal to the peer group that they are high sociable types.
Must have something to do with some parameters on the W versus the
yes. Yes.
A time, etc.
Yeah, no, all of this is for particular ranges of parameter values. In fact, I cut a bullet point. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, this is all for particular ranges of these parameter values, right? In particular, you have to worry about the returns to, like this functional form here, the functional form of the workers, of the firms. Right? There was I cut a bullet point which gave you the conditions under which you would get this separation and so on. Okay, so, okay, where am I? Okay. So there's an inefficient outcome. The signaling costs are high for the high sociability types, right? Now, the interpretation is, what's the interpretation? The equilibrium outcome involves inequality due to these information asymmetries. Okay? Now, what I'd like to point out, it's a very nice model, but it actually could be the same for any community. There's nothing in the model so far has told me that this is a model about African Americans. There's nothing in the model that says this is about African Americans. Zero. Okay?
This is what I was trying to get at. I mean, there's something about the way this model is set up that presupposes that for some communities the returns from the peer must be large rather than...
That's exactly the next bullet point. Beautiful. So this should predict the same phenomena for any ethnic or racial group. Where can we find the ethnicity or the racial group parameter? It's in the value of being accepted or rejected from the peer group. It's from the V underbar, as I've written it in my notation. And in the paper, there's a sentence in there. It is important to note that any racial or ethnic differences in the relationship between achievement and social acceptance comes through And in their paper, it's the V hat. I had to do V underbar because I don't have hats. Okay, so this is on page 560 in their paper. So that, it's all coming from what in my thing is the V underbar. How low or high is V underbar? Which is the importance of being accepted in this peer group. Or the importance of being, it's importance that the peer group attaches to accepting somebody, right? That's what it is, right? The importance that the peer group attaches to accepting somebody. That's the parameter. Okay? So that parameter then, we then have to match with different ethnicities and different, ethnic groups or, religious groups and so on. Okay? So if we move that around, we're going to get different outcomes. But that's the sole parameter in the model that does that. So we've got a signaling equilibrium, and the existence of this underachievement is due to this parameter. Okay? So again, it's a very useful model, but we haven't, I don't think, gotten extremely far in understanding why the African American community. So there's a lot of really wonderful discussion in this paper about this phenomenon and discussions in the press and so on, and discussions by sociologists, and yet in the model we don't see it. It's all coming through one parameter, and that's the parameter that we could move up and down.